So we stopped at California,
Okay.
and we were on the subject of trains, planes, and automobiles. How did you get to California?
Oh, in our Model I Ford. And when we first got there, we stayed in I don't know what to call them. They used to be little tiny houses arranged around a central area, and you parked your car there, auto something or another. So I can't think of what they used to call them.
So they're not really a hotel, or
No.
not really a cabin.
Yeah, well, they were more like a cabin than anything else. But I mean, they were. People usually stayed in them for relatively short periods of time, while they were looking for a more permanent place to live. I've got travel court stuck in my head.
Almost like a shanty town, then.
No. Sometimes they were quite new. Sometimes they were very attractive. But it's as though you took an acre of ground and you put a driveway down the middle, and off that driveway were little short parking areas, and then there would be a small, like an apartment, only it wasn't exactly that permanent looking on the inside. There was some of them even came furnished, and we still have them here. You pass them on big highways and things. I can't remember what to call them. That's all.
So this was in California. Where in California was that?
In Hawthorne, California, I presume. But because that's where we ended up, and then my parents went looking for a more permanent place to stay. And I have no idea how they found the piece of property in the house on 132nd Street in Hawthorne, which was a little south of the main part of town. It was on the side of a hill, and it was a little gray wooden house, which was divided into 4 equal-sized rooms. The living room, the bedroom, the kitchen, and the bathroom. All of them exactly the same size. And it had a big back porch, and because it was on a slope, the back porch and the underneath of the house were both accessible, from the ground around the back. And the front door was right at ground level. Well, this was kind of funny. I hadn't thought about this much before. But the people who either owned or used the house before my parents moved in had been bootleggers. And what they had done was to undo the connection between the bathtub and the septic system. And then they would put a cork or whatever in the bottom of the bathtub, and they would mix up some sort of booze in the bathtub and let it sit there and ferment and so on. And then they would go outside and stand underneath the house, and they would fill and cork all their bottles underneath the house. And they had some big racks, and they would put the bottles on the shelves, and I would presume let them age for a while. Well, needless to say, the bathroom did not smell like a regular bathroom, and the bathtub had lines in it from different heights of brew that had been made there. And the yard was full of broken bottles and all sorts of rot from them. And they had apparently not done much else in the house, I guess, because when my mother and dad did decide to rent this house, it was on a big piece of ground. And so my dad was out cleaning up the yard, getting rid of all those broken bottles and tops, and trying to, and there were lots of fleas. It was a sandy yard with a lot of sand fleas in it and so on. And so my dad raked and Mother was cleaning the house. And she cleaned the bathtub and cleaned the whole bathroom all up, and my dad reattached the tub and all of that. And then she decided to attack the kitchen, and it had, for that time, a regular stove which had a raised oven. And she thought that apparently the top of the oven wasn't going to need too much attention because it was black.
Oh boy.
And when she stood on a stool and actually got up to the top, suddenly realized that it was black because there was grease all over it. So she took a spatula and was going to take the grease off, but when she dug away at it, actually there was a whole layer of newspaper underneath the
gross.
grease, and you couldn't even see it. So Mother finally got the stove all cleared up, and Dad built a kitchen table, and so on and so on. And there was a nice big back porch. And they bought 2 great big tubs and put them on the back porch on a bench that Dad built. And then he would take the hose and fill the tubs for Mother when she wanted to do the laundry. And she would heat water on the stove in the house, and then you did all the laundry by, first you had a tub full of soapy water, and it was hot or warm, and you plunged the clothes upside down and soaped them or did whatever was needed. And then you had a wringer which was attached to the side of the tub, and one of the things I got to do was to turn the wringer.
Now you used to have a picture of that somewhere.
And
You think you still have the picture of
I
that?
have no idea. I don't ever remember even seeing it.
What heated your stove? Was it gas or
Gas. It was a gas stove, yeah. So then you drop the clothes into the second great big tub, and that had cold water with a little bit of bluing in it. And then they got rinsed in that, and then you swung the what is it?
the
Rollers. What, you know?
The ringer again.
Huh?
The ringer.
The ringer. And you swung the ringer around and you ran them through the ringer again and into a basket. And then you carried them down off the porch, and we had a clothesline, and they got hung up on the clothesline and so on. So that was how you did the laundry. The space under the house, Dad finally got it all cleaned out, saved some of the good bottles, and then we made root beer. And it was quite warm under the house, and sometimes when we'd made root beer and Dad had them all capped and they were sitting underneath the house and so on, and once in a while, if it were a hot day, suddenly you'd hear pow, and that was another root beer bottle that had decided to ferment and got to be too big for the gas was too much for the bottle to hold. But basically it was fun because when we wanted to open a bottle of root beer, Mama would stand there with a dishpan and Dad would unscrew the top, and sometimes it would go whee, and it was mildly alcoholic root beer, and sometimes it wasn't. But so Dad and Mom and Dad cleaned up this little house. The lady that owned it, when she rented it to them, told them that it was in sad shape. And my dad said, well, if you will give us X number of free months rent, I will clean up the house and the yard. And if you will buy the paint and leave the paint, I will paint everything. So my dad did. He painted both the outside and inside of the house. Over time then, they managed to gradually get some furniture. My brother and I had bunk beds, and so we had the bedroom. And of course my mother and dad had dressers in there and hung things in the closet. But my mother and dad slept in the living room on on a couch that converted at night into a double bed. And the kitchen was the same size as the living room and the bedroom and the bathroom. And the bathroom was in the southwest corner of the house. So in the wintertime, when it was chilly, the bathroom often was quite warm because it had great big windows in it, just like every other room in the house. And the one window was particularly nice because it looked straight out at the Palos Verdes.
Oh, nice.
And my mother would put a mat in the bottom of the big bathtub, and that was my brother's playpen. And I had my toys and stuff on the floor, and my mother had her sewing machine. And so on winter days, that's where I played on the floor, and my brother in the bathtub, and my mother worked on her sewing machine in the bathroom, because it was just a nice big room as well as being a bathroom. The back porch was a good size and was attached to the main floor of the house. And then there was a little, I don't even know what to call it, there was a connection between the back porch and the kitchen, and it was not very big, and at one point I think it probably had some kind of cupboards or what have you.
The breezeway.
Kind of like, but it had the ice box there, and the ice box was, in place of a refrigerator. Not very many people had refrigerators in those days, and so the iceman came up the road a couple of times a week, I guess, and we had a sign. A bright colored sign that you put in the front window of the house, and it said in great big bright colored letters 25 cents on one side and 10 cents on the other. I think that's right. Anyhow, whatever it was that it said, one was for half a block of ice and the other one was for a whole block of ice. And he would come up the hill and look to see whether or not we wanted. If you didn't have anything in the window, he wouldn't stop. But he would carry the ice into the house and put it in the ice box and so on. And we had a big geranium hedge. Oh, it must have been probably 5 feet tall anyway. And when we heard the ice truck coming up the hill, my brother and I, this is when he was older, we were older, my brother and I would hide in the geranium hedge, and when he stopped the truck and started walking in with the ice, we would quick run around the back of the truck and hop up in the back, and I would hold out my top or something, and we would put ice chips in there, and then we'd hop down and run back and sit in the geranium hedge and eat ice chips. And for years I didn't know this, but my mother told me one time later when I don't know, I must have seen an ice truck or something and said something to her. And she said, oh yeah, the iceman was very nice. After he put the ice in the ice box, he would stand and chat a minute. Then he'd say, well, I think the children have probably got enough ice by now, and then he'd walk out and drive away, it was fun.
How long did you live in that house?
Well, it must have been quite a while, because I would guess that we probably lived there from the fall of 31 or the winter of 31, 32. And we didn't move out of there until about 39, I think. And when we did, it was because my dad had been working for Douglas Aircraft long enough that we could afford to buy a house finally again. So we bought the house on 120th Street.
So there's your airplanes. What do you remember about him working for Douglas?
I don't really remember much about his working for Douglas. I mean, Dad went off to work in the morning and came home in the afternoon, but Douglas Aircraft was a big company. they used to have a plant pretty much where LAX is now. And after we moved there, they started building LAX. And the very first, up until the time that they had started building the big airport, there was a small one there where they had a couple of big pylons, one at each end of a huge big field. And it was a place where little aircraft would come and they'd do air races and that sort of thing on weekends and holidays. But in between times, there was a man who raised burros and donkeys for the movies. And so during the week, when the airplanes weren't using it, he would herd the animals out and they would eat all the grass. And then on the weekend, he would herd them all back into his farm and so on. Which reminds me that I think primarily when we still lived in the house on 132nd Street, my dad knew a couple of people in the Canadian Legion who already worked for the movies. And when they found out that he was an expert horseman, they somehow arranged it so when they were going to be filming a very horse active movie and they had stars in the movie, they would have my dad turn up, and he had regular riding clothes. He had riding breeches and riding boots and the whole bit, a quirt too, and he looked very great. But anyhow, he would turn up and before the actors got on the horses, he would take one horse after another and gallop it around for about 5 minutes to kind of take the edge off it, because after all, they didn't want their actors to take a chance of getting bucked off the horse or what have you. So Dad would ride them one after another and take the edge off them. So he got to meet quite a few different actors. And I can remember being at a Canadian Legion affair and being introduced to some very famous actors. I can't think of their names right now. I'll have to think about that and let you know what their names were. One of them in particular was a gentleman that was very, very nice and liked kids and made a point always of talking to us and so on.
Planes, trains, and automobiles.
Yeah, well, when they were building the airfield, the man with the donkeys, I guess, had sold the property to them or whatever. I don't know anything about that. But the very first thing that they had to do was to put in an underground drainage system for the airfield. And that meant that there were all these absolutely huge, big, what we called tunnels. And we kids used to ride our bikes over there, and then we'd chase each other all around through these big drainage tunnels and what have you. And of course, once they actually got into the real airport development stage, we couldn't do that anymore. Besides which, I guess by then we'd outgrown it anyhow. So yeah. Planes, not much more on planes that I can think of.
What was the first plane trip you ever took?
Oh, the first plane trip I ever took? I don't even remember.
What was it like to ride in a plane back then?
Well, I guess maybe the first plane trip I ever took was, I'll have to back up for a minute. You know, trains were important in those days. And of course, we had driven out to Southern California, you know, by way of Colorado. But I would guess we probably had been in Southern California close to 2 years. when my mother, I think, got very homesick. And she told my dad she really wanted to go home to Detroit. And of course, we were very, very short of money. And we still had our car. And my dad told her that he was going to buy her a ticket. And I think he had to sell the car to buy her a round-trip train ticket. And put Mother and me and my baby brother on the train, and told her that when she got to Detroit, she should write him right away and let him, after she'd been there a while, and let him know whether she wanted to stay in Detroit or whether she wanted to come back to Southern California. If she stayed in Detroit, he was going to have to hitchhike or find a way of getting back to that area. But that she should be careful, and if she decided to stay in Detroit, she could turn in her return ticket, and then she would have some money of her own, but that she would be staying with her mother and father. So anyway, he packed us all up and put us on the train, and the first stop that I remember was in Albuquerque. And I remember that because there were all these Indian ladies on the big train platform, and they had all these things for sale, all kinds of Indian pots and baskets and weavings and the whole thing. And I remember thinking how fascinating it was. And sharing the area of the train that we were in was, in my recollection, a gigantically fat lady who, when my brother cried, she had ankle-length dresses, and she would part her knees, which made sort of a hammock between her knees, and then she'd pick up my baby brother and would drop him into this hammock between her knees and rock him back and forth until he would go to sleep.